Sure. Ready? Okay, welcome everybody. We're going to discuss planning a new garden today, um, and how to start one from scratch or improve the one you have if you already have one. Um, so why do you want to have a garden?
Well, first, who are you?
Oh, I don't know. I'm Pam, and this is my partner in crime, Jocelyn, and we're from the Lyon Township Library, and we're putting on this program tonight. Um, so I'm going. So why garden? So fresh, clean, and healthy food. To be sustainable. Some people get a real kick out of for providing as much food for themselves as they can. Um, and in a I guess if you want to say the last year has proven to a lot of people that having a garden it might be a really good idea. And that kind of falls into the next category of food security, um, access to food. Um, if you're food insecure, it means that at any time, if the supply chain is broken, that you might not be able to have access to enough food or good food. So if the more you can grow and preserve yourself, the more that you can always know that you've got that in your um, pantry, I guess, to feel more secure. You can save money on your grocery bill. You can, for the price of maybe one package of bell peppers at the store, you can grow 20 bell pepper plants. Um, Exercise and fresh air. It's always a good idea to get outside and get fresh air, and having a garden kind of forces you to do that. You have to check on it, you have to water it, you have to grow and harvest the vegetables. Variety, you can usually find in seed catalogs and um, even in starts from at the nursery, you could find a lot more variety than you can at the store. You may not have, you may at the store, you may go in there and there may have 3 or 4 different types of tomatoes where you can have an infinite number of tomatoes if you grow your own from seed or from starts. Um, Heritage, I one of the main reasons I garden, or at least one of the reasons I gardening is enjoyable to me, is that it's a connection to my past. My father was an avid gardener, and my mother, and but my dad was the one that did the vegetable garden, and he passed away when I was in my early 20s. So I still feel next to him and near him in the garden, and so that, and that's kind of my heritage, my genealogy. Everybody was farmers, so to me it's a kind of a tradition to have a garden. And personal satisfaction. There's a lot to be said for that. You can get a lot of satisfaction of having a garden, of eating a meal that you entirely grew yourself or almost entirely grew yourself, and you're taking responsibility for your food supply. um, this is a food versus lawn slide. I don't know how it might be, even this is several years old, that the statistics might be even more shocking now than ever. But 50% of American residential water um, goes to watering lawns. And I know lawns are pretty and they're nice for children to play on, but my gosh, we put an enormous amount of resources, time, money, and pollution goes into maintaining those yards. If you replace some of those lawns with gardens, you're not only producing food, but you're saving a lot of time and money and expense and possible chemical exposure from not having lawns. So let's get started. So you've decided you want a garden. The first thing you do is you have to choose your area, and choosing your area depends on most vegetable gardens. You have to have about 6 hours of sun per day minimum. Um, so kind of look around your yard. If you have a lot of old trees, some people find that the only place they have to put a garden in is their front yard. Um, in some places you can get away with that, in some places you can't. But you have to. It is important that you have sun. Now, some vegetables in the garden need less sun than others. A salad garden doesn't need as much sun as, say, sweet corn or squash. And so, you can make up for less sun exposure with what you grow. Access to water is really important. Um, as you find here at the library garden, we have there's no easy way to water this garden, so we have to chain together a series of hoses and things to get water out there. It takes about an hour to water for 5 minutes of watering. Um, so having water nearby is really important for irrigation. Now, sometimes in Michigan, we don't have to water much in the summer. We get a nice wet summer, but sometimes we get long stretches of no water, and your garden just isn't going to produce if it's bone dry a great deal, especially when they're forming their fruit. Um, it's good to have level ground, but if you don't, you can garden on a slope, or you can kind of cut in, maybe build up one side of your garden, um, or you can do it. Problem is in a slope is that a lot of you, if you are watering, a lot of your water is going to run down instead of staying up where it is. Some people get by a slope by putting in raised beds that they can level the bed and kind of um, get around it that way. Good drainage. You do not want to put your garden where, say, in the spring there's standing water. Um, that's not a good situation. Again, sometimes if your drainage isn't good, or your yard is really soggy in the spring, like the backyard out by the at the library, out by the pond there, it gets kind of squishy. So our garden, we moved up farther in a little bit higher ground. So drainage can be helped by using raised beds again, so that because they drain very well. So there are ways to get around all of these problems. Do check if you are part of a neighborhood with a homeowners association. You may have there may be rules about having a garden. I know some of the neighborhoods in the New Hudson area are not supposed to have gardens in their yards. We affectionately refer to people who turn in their neighbors for having vegetables as the yard police. I should say unaffectionately, but um, yeah, I think it's a sad thing when you live in a neighborhood that won't let you have a garden. That hurts my heart. Soil types. Actually, in this area of Michigan, we generally are very fortunate that most of the area has a sandy loam, which is really good for gardening. It drains pretty well, unless you're in a really low area. But um, we've, it is the best for gardening. But even if you have a new house and that you end up with a lot of builder's sand around your house, you don't have to despair. You can mix in a lot of compost, topsoil, things like that to um, help, because sandy soil, the drains super fast and the nutrients don't stay around the plant roots. They just wash out. Clay is the opposite problem. It's heavy, it's dense. Um, it doesn't drain. So if you have a lot of clay in your soil, again, you're going to want to break that up with compost. And over time, you can really, really, by adding compost and incorporating green manures, which we'll go through later, cover crops, you can really get that soil brought into really good shape. Um, When I know that some people have thought, well, if I have clay, which is heavy and dense, I can add some sand, which drains well, and um, that'll solve the problem. Well, what sometimes that ends up you just make cement. So you put sand and clay together, and it can actually make your problem worse. So compost is the best thing to add to any of these types of soil. And even if you have a nice loam, adding compost regularly keeps it good. Your If you grow crops over and over again, your garden soil will get depleted. Um, Generally, the uh, wisdom of the current world is to not till or not till very often. It's more understood now that the soil actually has a structure, and there's mycorrhizae, um, fungal, like important uh, fungus, not bad fungus, but that kind of preserves the structure in the soil and actually supports the plants. If you till, you break that up, you disrupt the earthworms, you disrupt a lot of things, and it also brings um, weeds up to the surface, weed seeds. So low till or no till is best these days, and never work wet, soggy soil. If you rush out in the spring um, to turn over your dirt, and there's big clods of dirt, those are just going to dry, and then you'll have really um, you'll have nice big dry clods of dirt instead of. And so you wait till your soil has drained, and if you have a damp area, and until you start working on it in the spring. Now, some people like to get their soil tested. Most soil tests test for pH, and then the NPK, which is nitrous, phosphorus, and potash. And if you have a really good sandy loam, and you have it tested, it can recommend that you add this or that to it. And if it's low in nitrogen or it's low in phosphorus, they may recommend that you add certain things to your soil. um, I did put a link in here. MSU has a home soil test that you can use to get started uh, with that. They're also, if you are near an extension office, which for ours in this area is ours is in Oakland County, offices up in Pontiac, so it's not exactly right next door. So you might want to do a mail-in soil test. There are also home soil tests that you can buy, and those kind of could give you they're not as complete, I guess, is one that you get done by the professionals, but they sure can give you a good idea of what's going on with your soil. Um, Chemical fertilizer versus organic, you have to make that decision. Obviously, I really tend toward the organic. Chemical fertilizers usually aren't really complete, whereas organic has a lot of trace um, minerals, trace uh, not just minerals, but I'm trying to find the word. But anyway, that you can, when you want to build up your soil, there are nice organic mineral additives you can put in. These are slow release, they release over a long period of time, so you don't have to add them all the time. Green sand is one that you usually have to purchase. It's not, but bone meal and rock phosphate, dolomite, and lime can usually be found in hardware stores and feed stores. Um, I haven't had good luck finding green sand in there, but green sand is just a minerally sand that's mined, and I can't even tell you where it's mined, but you can buy it and have it shipped to you, but it's usually in small packages because it's obviously heavy. But the other things you can usually find, and rock phosphate is really slow release. Um, just regular garden lime, you want to be careful. You don't want to just go willy nilly with it. because you can overlime your soil. Other organic additives are compost and green manure, which basically means that you grow a cover crop and mix it into your soil, turn it over, and then let it rot. And that actually, really puts a lot of um, humus and organic material. When I say organic in this sense, I'm not talking about organic of, like no sprays or anything, but organic in the sense that it's not a chemical. Alfalfa meal, cottonseed meal, castings, and you can also buy mycorrhizal root fungi in the store. I I buy it in. It just comes in a paper bag or a bag, and you can just add it to the soil, kind of inoculate it. These are all things that you can add above and beyond, you know, a fertilizer that has nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash in it, because there's a lot of things plants need beyond those things. Um, you might want to think about your garden tools. Um, everybody's going to want a shovel and a garden rake. And there's more than one kind of rake. The garden rake that we're talking about is the flat type, as opposed to the long tined type that you use for raking grass. Um, that type is good too, but for when you use a rake in your garden, you're trying to level the soil and smooth it out. And so this is the best type of rake for that. Um, there's a couple of types of shovels. You've got the pointed shovel, which is good for digging. The flat top shovel is better for like shoveling compost and just for cleaning up flat surfaces. So both kinds are nice. And some type of hoe. There's a ton of hoes out there, and there's collinear hose which are very sharp and very narrow, and then there's a wide hose that we think about, the kind my dad always had, and in a middle a bunch of them in between. So you've kind of got to go and see what fits well and try them out and see how you know how it feels to use them, what kind of handle they have. um, Wood handled ones are very aesthetically pleasing, but if you leave them out in the rain too many times, then the wood's going to get funky. So sometimes the fiberglass or some of the others might be better for you if you're not good at putting your tools away at the end of the day. And up at the top, I've got a spading fork that is different from a pitchfork, which is used to pitch hay. This is a fork that is used to dig usually things like potatoes and other tubers, where you put it in the ground straight in and then kind of gently lean back on it to kind of push the vegetables up so that you can get them.
They're also very good for weeding.
Well, everything's good for weeding if you. And then another thing that's good to have are stakes and string. It kind of helps if you don't have like beds that are surrounded by wood. It helps delineate your surface. You can mark rows with them. And that's just it's kind of a style thing, what kind of garden you grow, because if you like everything in straight rows and evenly spaced, um, stakes and string are the really important part of that. If you're kind of a free form gardener and you think I'm just going to just put stuff in and here's a spot I'm putting that in, and that has its merits too. So but yeah, it's kind of nice to have a few stakes and some string around just to and sometimes I put it down when I've planted something just until it comes up, so you don't forget that you put it there. um, and some people like to, like, kind of in that picture, to put a seed packet or something on the top of the stake so they know what they planted there. Hand tools. Most of my gardening now I do in raised beds, so I don't need a lot of big tools. My raised beds are tall, so I almost exclusively use hand tools, except for the spading fork. I use that when I'm digging up carrots and potatoes and things. But some of my favorites are here. I like there's kind of a set there in the middle picture. Um, that you can there's lots of sets available. There's some are ergonomic and but I find when I go out to choose, and I have all of them, I like the claw type of a cultivator that's on the right side. I like a really tall, a really long trowel. The one that's shown here is stainless steel. It's very heavy duty, and I've had so many trowels bend on me that, and this one never has. I actually have two or three sizes of this one. Um, so, and they're not that much more expensive than anything else, and they're super heavy duty. They're a Wilcox brand. And then on the left, there's it's a, it's kind of called an Asian cultivator. There's lots of different um, um, terms for it, but it's kind of like a little scythe almost. You just very very handy and very easy to dig and cultivate and weed with that. Very precise because of the pointers. Um, um, Somebody's asking about a garden knife. Yeah, those are sometimes called hori horis. I have one of those too, and they're nice because you can put them in a holster and wear them and have it with you all the time. But um, it can be a multi-purpose thing. You can use it as kind of as a trowel, or you can use it to weed with, or you can use it to. Um, Sometimes you need to cut if you need to cut your string for your strings, there's lots of, so a garden knife is actually very handy. And the clippers up at the top, those are, I think, Felcos or some type. But again, a good set of garden clippers is really really nice to have when you've got uh, even some for harvesting. Some things are hard to harvest without clipping them off. They just don't drop right off the plant. Tomatoes are easy to pick, but sometimes peppers, eggplants, you need a clipper to get those dislodged from their plant. But it's a very personal thing, and it's like I said, my the three I use the most are right here, but other people might have a totally different set of tools that they like. Uh, and some people think, well, if I'm going to have a garden, I need a rototiller. Well, that's not really true. You don't. And even if you can rent them too from, I think the big box stores usually have rentals. Um, if you have, if you can't handle a big tiller, they've got little ones on the left there. That's a little Mantis, but the other brands make them too. They're very light. They weigh about 9 or 10 pounds, and they're easy to start, and they're really nice for if you have raised beds that aren't super high. If they're maybe only a foot tall, then you can work in your raised beds with those. Um, Tillers, like I mentioned before, are really good for, like, if when you're first establishing your garden area. Sometimes you if you want an instant garden, bringing in a rototiller, and it's going to point out where all the rocks are by and it's going to, you can make it deep, but um, tilling every year can be harmful to the structure of the soil. A lot of people are really attached to their tillers, and that's okay. I'm married to one of them. Um, I We garden in mostly raised beds, but we do have a patch that we put tomatoes and corn in, and we kind of, you know, uh, rotate the crops. One year we'll do one, and one year we'll do the other. Um, and that's where he's allowed to have his rototiller, and so he's happy. I'm happy. Everybody's happy. But you do not need a rototiller. And if you do want one for starting the garden, you can rent one or borrow one. Um, it's not definitely not something you have to own. Um, if you're just starting your first garden, it's probably a good idea to start somewhat small. I wouldn't rip up a half an acre if you've got it right away, because if it's better to make a few mistakes in the beginning on a small scale before you start applying it to large scale. But on the other hand, um, if you've got the space, why not do it? But a lot of people are intimidated by that. So we're going to talk about starting a small garden at first. Again, look, put it where you get the most sun. Um, and if you a small garden, you have to be really efficient with your use of space. You aren't going to put wide rows in your small garden. You're going to want to be able to reach everything from the side. Uh, and that's really important when you think about how wide you're going to make. If you're going to have a raised bed, uh, definitely no more than 4 feet wide. You can make them as long as you want, but as far as wide, you have to be able to easily reach into the middle. For some people who are shorter in stature or have shorter arms, maybe 3 feet is enough. You got to be able to comfortably reach the middle. Um, and succession planning, when you have a small garden, you become more, you can put very early spring things in like radishes and turnips and lettuce, and then follow that in the summer with other plants that prefer the warmer weather. So you can act, and then you can do it again in the fall. You can plant some cold crops again, so you can actually get 3 seasons of plants out of one little area. Definitely, sometimes people, when they put in a new garden like a raised bed, they bring in compost or topsoil or a compost topsoil mix to fill it. That's the quick and easy way. As most people starting a new garden don't have a big compost pile just waiting to fill up their garden. So you can expect, um, if you're going to put in a small raised bed garden, that you're going to have to buy bagged or have some um, um, compost and topsoil. Manure is a choice. Some people, I don't use manure in my bed anymore. Any of my garden beds. It's been a long time since I have. It tends to bring in seeds, um, large animals, small animals. Even if like horses don't have enough stomachs to digest the seeds, so a lot of seeds come out the other end just like they went in, and you're actually just inoculating your garden with a bunch of seeds, as well as the good part of the manure, the nitrogen and the other trace elements. But you have to be really careful about using manure. Cow manure is a little bit better because of their added stomachs. They tend to digest things. Any cud chewing animal like cows and goats tend to have um, their manure is better for the garden. Goat manure is probably rabbit manure. That's some of the better manures you can use. Um, Paths. You want to have paths in your garden because you don't want to walk on your growing bed. It compacts the soil. Um, that's why raised beds have become so popular. Is that you work from this side. You're not walking in on your raised beds. At least I hope you aren't. And if you do want to get in there, you can always lay a big piece of cardboard or a board over there to kind of, um, what's the word I'm looking for?
Spread
To
out your weight.
Yeah, yeah. There's a really good word for it, but yeah, basically, you just want to, you're not stepping down in one spot. You're spreading your weight around a little bit. Um, but definitely try never to walk on your growing areas. Now, the best place thing to do is plan the fall before to put in your garden. Well, if you're putting one in the spring, we've already missed that boat. And that's okay, because most of the time, most people don't tend to think ahead. But if you do, you want to define your area and your boundaries, as we talked about before, with the sun and the drainage. You could lay down newspaper, cardboard, and then cover that with soil and compost and straw and leaf mulch, and just leave it there. You don't even have. You can just put it right on top of the grass or whatever. Is where you're going to put your. Most people are digging up lawn. Um, So and in the spring you check the soil. If you want to turn the soil in the spring, you can, but it kind of defeats the purpose. Cardboard and newspaper often don't break down just in one winter. So you definitely want to cover it with other, with bring in some of that compost or straw, um, your leaves. Um, Using leaves for fall leaves for mulch is a wonderful idea. It's really great if you can run them through a shredder or run over them with a lawnmower to kind of break them up a little bit. The more surface area on your leaves, the better they break down. um, big big leaves can actually, um, you know too much of them can form a really thick matted area, which is hard to plant in. So it's always a good idea to try to if you've got a shredder, that's even better. But I made a rhyme. um, but um, so in the spring you can plant right into that area, or you can, like I said, some people are going to want to turn it if they want to, but you don't need to, and just plant. But here we are in the spring, so if you might have an extra step or two, but you want to, if you may want to remove the sod. You can also, somebody said, how thick is too thick a layer of chopped leaves? Well, chopped leaves, not so bad. It's better if it's mixed in with other things, though. They break down faster. Um, we at our house, one of the lazy mans, we use our mulching mower and just run over it and catch it in the bag, instead of letting it go on the ground once the leaves start. And so we have a mixture of grass clippings and leaves that are kind of broken down, and it makes a really good mulch. Um, so in the spring, if you want to this is a time where a rototiller may come in handy. Um, it's probably a good idea to remove the sod, but you don't have to. You may find little bits of pieces of grass growing up if you run a rototiller over it and till the sod in. So that's an option. But tilling or using a spading fork, go about 8 to 12 inches. Most plants, that'll be suffice for most plants. Roots. Um, Take out sticks, stones, debris, glass, whatever you might find under your lawn, and then mix some good compost, and maybe even some topsoil if you find that your the soil in the area is kind of thin and doesn't seem to have a lot of organic matter. um, it's more, I guess you could say, if you're not used to telling, well, how do I tell if it has enough organic matter? Well, if you pick up the dirt and it feels um, thin and sandy, rather than, like, I guess you could say, like a chocolate cake. You want it to feel more like it's kind of holding together, and it's got some spring to it. And and if your soil is really thin, you probably need to put some organic matter in it. In the spring, I would recommend, if you have the means, to get a few cubic yards of topsoil and compost mix delivered, or just compost, and get that, work that in. That can be a little pricey. Not everybody has that option. So you start working in those, grass clippings, anything you can find. Try to make sure the grass clippings come from an untreated lawn. You don't want, the chemicals in the lawn that keep weeds from growing will also um, keep your garden from growing, because most of those are broadleaf um, plants. So but if you have neighbors that um, have those big clumps of grass left in the lawn after they mow, say, can I rake those up and keep them? And they'll look at you and say, well, whatever, go ahead. And what's one person's leftovers, it's another person's gold. So um, the problem is the sooner you want to plant, the more finished the compost has to be. If it's still like right now, and you wanted to put some grass clippings and leaves from last winter into the soil, they still, and you're planning, well, I probably won't plant till the end of May for your warm weather crops, then you can probably get away with putting some unfinished things in your soil, and they'll have a little bit of a few weeks to break down. um, but if you want to plant right away, you should try to, even if you go to the store and buy a few bags of finished compost, preferably organic, and mix that in, anything's going to help and anything's going to improve. And as you work with your bed over time, you're going to keep adding. Um, Somebody's asking the best time to grow. I've got actually going to touch on that in a little bit if you want to hang on. Um, so um, I'm a big fan of raised beds. They warm up faster in the spring. The space is really defined. You don't have grass creeping back into your beds if you have um, uh, some kind of structure around them. You don't have to. You can do raised beds without boards. A lot of people think that they have to build something to have a raised bed, and that's absolutely not true. They're efficient, they're productive, um, they warm up and drain earlier in the spring. So if you do live in a soggy area, a raised bed's gonna um, get you in the garden faster. I find them a lot easier to maintain, to weed. Um, you can, if it's a lower raised bed, you can still use hose and your other long handled garden tools. Um, I've got at home, mine are about 3 feet tall, and I put those in to plan for my old age because I still want to garden when I'm really old if I get there. So, you know, I just use hand tools for the most part. So that, the taller they are, the easier they are to maintain with hand tools. Um, and since you're not walking on your raised beds, your soil is loose, not compacted, and there's more air in the soil. The plants can put out their roots more easily. They're not having to fight the compacted earth to grow. You've in any fertilizer, and when I say fertilizer, I'm including compost and things like that. You're putting them right where you're growing. You're not putting them on the paths. So, and like I said, you can buy prefab raised beds. They've got kits you can buy right at Lowe's and Home Depot and places like that. You can make your own sides with the probably the best um, thing would be cedars or redwood, both fairly expensive woods, especially now. Or you can use like pine boards, which are less expensive. They're going to not last forever. They you may have to replace them every 3 or 4, 5, 6 years. Um, and sometimes you get more time, out of a untreated. You don't want to use treated wood as a rule. Um, there's chemicals that they use to treat them. Uh, there's a lot of controversy now because a lot of people are saying, well, they don't use the nasty stuff in the treated wood anymore, so it's safer to use. So I would do my homework if you want to use treated wood. Find out what chemicals were used in it, and you can make your decision. And like I said, you don't have to put sides on your raised bed at all. I've got some pictures coming up that which shows that. Another thing I really like about raised beds is you can if you make them all the same size, everything can be modular. You can have hoops and fences and trellises in there that are made just for the size um, that are made just for your raised bed, and really easy to install and take apart at the end of the year. So here's some examples of raised beds. In the top right, um, this is an example of a raised bed that it doesn't have any sides at all. They basically just build it up and it may be slightly mounded. And they're using straw in the paths. So they only walk where the straw is, and the straw is mulches, keeps the weeds down in the path. Some people mow they make their paths long enough or wide enough to get a mower through. So you can actually even plant sod down or something like that down there, but it tends to encroach on your garden. You do need to do a little bit more edging and upkeep if you put grass around. So most people go for some type of an organic material like wood chips or straw that will break down eventually and have to be reapplied, but that's a good thing. You want things that are going to break down. You really want to avoid any artificial, um, with the exception being ground cover. I really like using ground cover around my raised beds. And I'm talking about this rolled ground cover that you buy. It lasts for years. It's the same type of ground cover that's used to put that they put down in greenhouses to keep the weeds out, and it's pretty dense and heavy duty, and that's it's my favorite thing to put on paths because and you can always walk out there and your shoes stay clean. In the top left, I like the height of those raised beds. They're kind of a medium height, probably about 2 feet. The gravel that they're using around it looks like a ground limestone. Um, it's neat and pretty. Um, and The problem with any kind of gravel is eventually dirt and leaves and things fall into it and then form little pockets, and you're still going to get weeds coming up in there. So that, but it looks nice, and if you reapply it occasionally, it probably is fine. Um, Bottom left is those are about the height of mine, and mine are wider. Mine are 4 feet wide, but I really, as I'm going into my golden years, appreciate that height. It saves a lot of back breaking work, and in this type is a prefab one that you can buy that lady is joyfully picking from. Probably cedar, probably extremely expensive, but it's a kind of a example of what is available on the market. But they can also be built um, by hand. Galvanized metal is what we use for the sides of ours. And, a lot of other people use those too. So there's lots, if you go online, there's tons of plans for raised beds. On the lower right is what I was talking about, things being modular. These are little hoops made of PVC that can be plugged into the garden. And when they're not needed anymore, they can be taken away and stored and put back in. And those PVC pipes you can pound into the ground and then stick the arches into the pipe. And it's a pretty handy little um, situation to have. Yeah, again, raised beds require a little bit of outlay of, except for the mounded raised beds. There's some material costs in the beginning, but they should last for years and years and years. Uh, Square foot gardening is something that you can utilize in raised beds, but that doesn't have to be in raised beds. You can use it in any kind of gardening. Um, this is usually there's there's books written about it. There's plans, and this is a plan that I pulled off of online that you can use to. It's a grid, and you can plant. It tells you how many vegetables of each type you can fit in 1 square foot. Some people actually put a um, string or other type of kind of a visual element in their garden to kind of show them where the square feet are. Um, you can do that or not, um, but you generally plant like trellising things on the edge. Like here's some cucumbers and some peas. Um, you can fit 9 garlics in that spot or onions. You can fit a dozen carrots in each square foot, 1 tomato plant, um, maybe a 9, what it may spinach, collards, lettuce, some type of greens, um, and maybe one potato plant in each square foot. Now, the hitch and to get along with that is that some of these plants get very large, and when I'm really pointing at tomatoes when I say this, that putting 3 tomatoes in that close together, you're going to have quite a jungle of tomatoes, and it's probably so. um, I feel like the square foot method is awesome. It's very efficient. You're in and you it helps you understand how many fit, but tomatoes is probably the one thing in that whole grid that I wouldn't probably put in a square foot garden. If I did, I would put them toward the back or what the end and give them about 4 squares, not one. Um, mini squares for the tomatoes, because tomatoes basically get large. You can buy dwarf tomatoes now that don't take up so much room, and perhaps that would work in a square foot garden. Um, but yeah, they take a lot of room. But otherwise, I'm a big fan of this method. And as you can see, this person in the upper right actually made their irrigation system also their square foot guide. So this is obviously a 4 square foot little system that you can buy those ready-made little square foot gardens at the hardware stores. And some ingenious person made this little watering slash divider system. Um, on the, to the left of that, there's someone else puts in, they've got trellises on the ends, and they also have dividers. But you don't have to have dividers. You can just eyeball it or measure it and just put things like this. um, those look like pak choys, so they've got very large, they probably got 1 or 2 per square feet. Big lettuce plants, 1 per square foot. So if you're going to let your lettuce grow to full size heads, that means they're going to need more space than lettuce that you're just broadcasting for just to snip the leaves. So you got to consider the ultimate size of your produce. Um, on the lower right, he's got a nice little contraption there he made to keep the critters out of his bed, um, and that's really awesome if you have a lot of trouble with deer or rabbits and groundhogs, things like that. It's a small little garden, but you got to start somewhere. There's straw bale gardens. We've had a couple of programs about these in the past, but generally, you condition the bales ahead of time and hollow out spots in them and fill them with dirt, or you can use the bales themselves as a side for a raised bed. And this is kind of good for an instant first year garden if you can get a hold of enough bales of straw, and then you can actually make a raised bed inside the straw bales. um, and you can do that. You don't even have to have a yard for that. You can do that on a driveway. I've known people that had very little yard, but they had a nice big sunny driveway, and so they would actually park their car on the street and grow vegetables in their driveway. That's dedication. Um, these types of gardens need a lot of watering and fertilizing because they drain really well. You want to make sure and get straw and not hay. Hay is actually full of seeds. Um, and you have to condition the bales by wetting them and letting them sit, and then you put a mixture of fertilizer in them, that high nitrogen, so they start to kind of break down. um, you put soil in them. Some people hollow out an area and put soil in. Other people just kind of move the straw aside and put a little bit of soil in there and a little plant. And um, I we thought about doing a straw bale garden here at the library in our garden, but as I mentioned before, trying to get water to this garden is very difficult, and I think they just need to be watered more often than we'd be able to do here. But all in all, it's fun. A lot of people really enjoy straw bale gardening. Um, so up at the top, this is the conditioning period, um, where the little seeds that are there, even straw has seeds in it. It's literally impossible not to have some kind of seeds. So when you are letting it conditioning the things, sometimes seeds will sprout, and you can flip the bale over and put them on the bottom, or you can just move them, pull them out, and plant there. Um, the one under that is these people made a nice frame for their straw bale gardens to keep it neat and tidy, and you can see they're very happy with it. Everything seems to be growing really well. Um, at the bottom one, they've hollowed it out some. They put quite a bit of dirt in there. They're growing some tomatoes and peppers. It looks like they've got it kind of in a uh, rectangular pattern. I've seen people that actually start a compost bin in the middle. They will start throwing some, leaves and garden waste and grass clippings and things in the middle, and just have a little compost pile in the middle, and um, kind of get two things out of that one. Now the other two, where they're actually using the straw bales as they frame for their raised bed, and so that's kind of an interesting thing. They'll last a few years, maybe two, three, and then they're going to break down. Then you could just use them as mulch and put them in your compost pile. But I mean, broken down, old straw makes excellent mulch, especially if it's, been wet and everything. It's kind of broke down. So you can use straw at any point. Um, Now, this gentleman at the top left is actually installing um, a drip hose in his to help keep it, so he doesn't have to water it so often, and that's a pretty good idea too. Um, there's a lot more. We have books on that in the library. There's a lot more to be learned. I'm just kind of skimming these things. Then there's lasagna gardening, which is a common um, term that's been used in the last few years, and it's basically what used to be called sheet composting, which is composting in situ. Um, it's a really good method for converting lawn into garden. As we mentioned earlier, if you start in the fall by putting down a layer of newspapers and cardboard and covering that with compost and topsoil and leaves and layers of things, and let that sit all winter, a lot of it's gonna break down. Um, and here's kind of the why they call it lasagnas, because everything, in an ideal world, you would put down, right over your lawn, you'd put a layer of cardboard, a layer of green, probably grass clippings, and then maybe some leaves, and then some more green and some more leaves, and so uh, you've got layers of good organic material there that are in it, and it may not be pretty the first year, when you've got the cardboard, and you're going to want to completely cover the cardboard so it doesn't blow away. Also, be careful where you source your cardboard. You really don't want to, it's preferably just plain old brown cardboard, not a lot of ink on it. You don't know if those inks have heavy metals in them. Um, so in some cardboard has a waxy coating on it, and some of it has other sorts of things embedded in it to make it more sturdy. You want to avoid that. Just plain old cardboard that you can rip easily is the best, without a lot of printing on it, is the best thing to use. Um, and you can see down on the lower left, those are lasagna gardens that were created, and now they'll just sit there that winter. And in the spring, you can just pull aside a little bit of that dirt and just pop your plants in, like they're doing in the lower right. Um, we've got a question about a small patio. We're going to cover that in just a minute, and we're going to talk about grow bags. Um, Large gardens, these are the kind I grew up with. My dad had about a half an acre garden, and and he was very traditional. He rototilled it every spring. He planted everything in rows, and so if you doing what has been discovered is that if you do wide rows rather than one skinny row, you're going to have a lot more production, and you're not walking so much on your bed. So if you look at the illustration in the lower right, um, if you do single rows with a path down the middle, or in the same thing, you could get another row in there by having 18 plants, um, and then your path. So you get a lot more production out of the same area. Um, and it's easy to irrigate, easy to weed. Um, Always try. We don't all have the um not all of our yards are perfectly situated for all of these things. So if you can go north to south with your rows, and this includes raised beds or anything else, that's probably the best way to do it. But like I said, sometimes we have to make do with what we have, and if you don't have a north south, if you can't do it that way, you can't do it that way. um, so you know my dad, I didn't really know much about mulch. He used fertilizer. He used DDT. I can remember following along behind him as he sprayed things. He did the best with what he knew how to do at the time. Um, but now we know better. As far as putting poison on the garden, everything you put in your garden is going to end up in your food. So you really want to use eh, organic and organic, both organic meaning no chemicals, and organic meaning a lot of added material to the soil, like compost. Um, a lot of times when these wide bed gardens, that's you can till down the middle if you want, or you can put in a path. But you basically want to put your put your room into working for you by planting more on each row, and less paths, more plants. So, these are examples of large gardens that are planted in rows. The first one, upper left is or upper right, is more traditional garden. Um, this was what my dad would have done, except for the straw. Um, the second, or the top left, is our wide rows, where instead of having one thing, just a soldier row down the middle, you've got two or three plants wide in there. Same for all of the other ones. The lower left is, you can actually buy ground cover that has these holes in it, so you just roll it out and plant in them. It helps keep the weeds down, helps keep the moisture in. The bad part about it is it's plastic, and depending on if you try to get more than 1 year out of it, eventually it's going to end up in the landfill. It doesn't break down. It doesn't add to the earth at all. Now, what you have under it might be, you might be having it over a nice, fertile humus and compost filled area, but ultimately, that plastic's going to go into the landfill, and we try to avoid that. Um, the just the other one on the lower right is just another example of they're planting um, of a wide bed with a path on either side. So now we're in container gardens, and there's an infinite amount of containers that you can use for your gardens. And even people who have garden space still like to often grow some of their vegetables. And you obviously can grow flowers in containers, but since we're this is more of a vegetable centric program, but I really like this illustration because here's a woman who probably doesn't even have a patio. She's just got steps leading up to her townhouse, and so she's making full use of that. I really love this picture because it's got a big tall sunflower in the bottom bag. Um, She's got pots. She makes it look pretty. She's got trellises. I just think that's awesome. Um, but you can have what's called earth boxes. You can garden in window boxes, pots, grow bags. You could grow on a balcony. All you really need is 6 to 8 hours of sun, and you can grow just about anything. You do have to be careful about drainage, especially if you're on a balcony. Your um, neighbors might not be thrilled if your garden drains onto their patio furniture. So you have to be really cognizant of what your neighbors are doing. You may have to have kind of a closed system where you've got maybe tubs underneath that catch the water that you can either use to rewater the beds or you can dispose of. But you really don't want to let your gardens drain onto your neighbors' balconies if you can help it. If you're over someone else, um, and use food safe materials. I would hesitate to garden like in styrofoam or something that most buckets that come, if you can get buckets from stores like our bakeries sometimes have 5 gallon buckets that they get frosting in and things like that. You can get all kinds of um, and 5 gallon buckets are excellent for growing in. You just have to make sure that you drill anything that doesn't have drainage holes. You have to put drainage holes in them. Um, so here's some examples of different containers that people have been real ingenious. Um, up in I especially like this one. I don't know why. It's just something that you might find in somebody might be throwing away at the side of the road, and you pick it up and you line um, it looks like they lined the little shelves with burlap, possibly sphagnum moss, but it looks like burlap to me. And they fill it with dirt and they just grow salads and herbs in it. It's just really cute and awesome idea. Middle upper is they're growing in Sterilite or Rubbermaid bins. Um, and then these are the grow bags that somebody asked about. I think they're really come on strong the last few years, and some of them are huge. I actually bought one um, this year that's about 3 to 4 feet around, and I have a area kind of in mind that's tends to be hard to control the weeds in. I'm just gonna plunk that there and fill it full of a compost and plant in it. And but they come in all sizes, from just maybe a quart size all the way up to many gallons. um, I think they're a great idea. He says, how do if I have opinion on them, I think that they're light, they're movable. Some of them have handles. Now, when they're really, if they're really wet and heavy, they're going to be, you might want to support them, like put them on something to move them. You don't want the bottom falling out. And just from the sheer weight of the soil and the water. Um, I think some people, I'm going to try it this summer. I'm going to grow some potatoes in them and see how that works. I know that's a real popular crop to grow in grow bags. I've never tried it. I'm going to try it. But you can see there somebody growing carrots in just a big old clay flower pot. You can Lettuce bowls are really cute and really popular. You can just find, if you got a shallow container of some kind, it can be a nice pretty pottery container like this. It can be a dish pan, you can drill some holes in. And you can just scatter some lettuce seed in it and let it grow and harvest. You can do the cut and come again method, where you take scissors and you harvest the lettuce a couple of inches from the crown, so that you're not cutting off the growing tip, and they'll grow back 2 or 3 times through the course of the summer. Lettuce does not like heat, so you can start a lettuce bowl early, and you can kind of move it into a shady area, and you might keep it going longer, because if it's only getting, you still want it to get some sun, but if it's not hitting like the hard afternoon sun, you might keep your lettuce bowl going longer. And when you're done with it, you dump it into the compost pile and put some fresh in there and start all over again for the fall. Um, the lower right is a galvanized water trough. Um, I've got a couple of these around my yards. I generally put herbs in them or flowers I plant in them, but they um, whatever you put in them should like heat because they do heat up when the sun hits them. So you want to put heat loving things in there. If it's vegetables, I'd say tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, basil, just like this one here would be good options because those are all heat loving plants. Not so great for broccoli and cabbage and things like that are cooler loving crops. Um, but again, just make sure you drill some holes in the bottom. Um, I mentioned earlier about homeowners associations. There are people that have gotten very clever about growing in their front and their backyard using vegetables as ornamentals. And the top two pictures are, they're kind of, they've got their flowers and stuff around, but these are all edible flowers. Pretty kales, they got a pretty amaranth there, and then kind of stuck in between everything, they've got a few tomato plants and a beautiful ornamental kale plant. And I say ornamental because it's beautiful, but it's thoroughly edible. This one on the right upper is mixed in with they've got some sedums and other herbs and things in here. Um, just very carefully growing their vegetables amongst uh, their flowers and things. On the lower left, this is this was several years ago now. I hate to think how long I've had this picture, but these people that had no sun in their backyard and they wanted to grow vegetables in their front yard, and their city ordinance didn't allow it. And they arranged a sit-in, and they put a bed out in their driveway and their signs, and they got some press attention, and they said, this is our garden bed, haha. And so they sat on the bed with their signs and got the papers and the local media coming over, and I think it was in Canada too, but they got a lot of attention, and ultimately the city um, rescinded the no garden in the front yard rule. And they made their points that having a lawn was stupid when they could have this nice productive garden that looks nice and neat. And so they did win their case. So vertical gardening is an excellent way to make room, a lot of extra space. Um, you've got, I mean, if you grow squash, beans, peas, lots of different vining crops. The top right is actually a cattle panel, another kind of trendy thing that has come into common use. Used to be, you can always buy these things like at Tractor Supply Company, and cattle panels coming from anywhere from 8 to 16 feet. I don't, they might come bigger, but I don't think so. They call them cattle panels because they're easy. They're prefab fencing that can be moved around and put up quickly by farmers to, obviously keep in cattle and other um, animals. But they've become very popular, and the is trellises. And the one that's in the upper right hand is a 16-footer that they've arched over and made an arching, and you could actually grow like cucumbers, squash in there, the fruits will actually hang down underneath and you can pick them from below. Very clever. um, you can, and then it's this more traditional trellis right underneath it. This is a fall picture after the vines have died, and look at all of the butternut squash that are growing on this trellis that that would have taken many, many, many square yards of garden space to grow that if they were growing it on the ground and just letting it sprawl around. But you train it up onto a trellis and you can get a lot of production out of that space. Um, this picture is when it was, like I said, the plants are dying, but it really shows how many squash were on that vine. Sometimes you don't realize how many until the frost kills the vines, and then all of a sudden it's like, wow, look at all those. Um, and then the bottom left is just another type of trellis. This is these A-frame trellises can be folded up and put away or leaned against a building in the winter time. Um, yeah, and you can and pull them out. Great for cucumbers. Not so, some green beans need a little bit taller than that. They easily go up 6 to 8 feet. Um, but this would probably grow most cucumbers and smaller varieties, and great for peas too. There's a lot of peas that are only get about 30 inches tall, and you technically don't need trellises for them, but it's easier to grow them on a trellis and easier to pick. Now I have a question in the comments. Have you tried a potato tower? I have not personally tried one. If have I don't know anyone who has really, but that does. I'm always interested in new garden techniques. Um, so where you put your plants in your garden is kind of important. If you're going to have a trellis, you want to do it at the north end, so it doesn't shade everything in the garden. Um, so tall, you want to put tall plants on one edge, or you can plant smaller plants on each side of tall plants. Um, Keep your high maintenance plants on the edge. These are things that have to be picked regularly, like green beans or something, that you want to keep on top of. You don't want them, getting, if they're too hard to pick, you're not going to keep them picked, and you're going to have giant green beans, which you can let them dry and and save them for seed. But if you if or something that needs trimming a lot, if your salad greens and stuff, you want to be able to get to those easily. uh, Also put floppy plants on the edge, so that buys you a few more inches of garden space if you don't have your floppy plants in the middle flopping on everything else. And I'm talking about things like a zucchini plant. If you don't want to have that in the middle of your garden, because ultimately it's going to flop over on everything else. Same with, keep your large bushy plants together. Just take care that you don't grow something small next to something big, and then the small ones will just get taken over. Um, Another thing is with short season crops, like a lot of times, like when I plant cabbage, I'll put in lettuce plants in between all the cabbage plants, because cabbage takes longer to grow. The lettuce will be harvested before the cabbage needs that spot. So you can kind of think about what more can I get in my garden just by using that technique. You plant radishes in the spring around things, because their radishes are about 30-45 days and they're out. Companion planting, you can mix it up. Uh, there's a whole school of thought about by planting, mixing up your plants in a bed, not having everything in a row. So maybe you'll have an eggplant and then a broccoli and then some spinach or kale, in with it. Those, yeah, and maybe some uh, potatoes. It just things that, what that does is it foils the bugs, because bugs like to find a row of something and just start chomping on them. But if you have, plants that, bugs are pretty specialized. They usually like cabbage, those little white moths that are always flying around in the summer are cabbage moths, and they are looking for cabbage, broccoli, kale, cauliflower, those types of plants to lay their eggs on. They're not going to look at your eggplants. They're not going to look at your tomatoes or your potatoes. So, if you kind of mix your plants up a little bit, it confuses the bugs. They're less likely to find your plants if you've got thing. And planting flowers in and around your plants is a great idea too. Um, so, and some flowers can be used to actually repel bugs with mixed results. Um, but yeah, these aren't soldier roads. These are all kinds of things. This is a salad garden, and it's a really great idea for if you want to kind of, they call mesclun mixes, or you can make your own. You've got some arugula, you've got some lettuce, you've got some different the mustard plants, and you grow them all together in one bed and pick from them. And again, lettuce is not related to arugula or kale, so they're going to have the bugs that bother one won't bother the other. Um, Over here with the cabbages, as I mentioned before, growing things around them that you can ultimately pull out when they get too big, or you can grow flowers around them that'll vine out. And but yeah, find a little extra spaces wherever you can. This is an example of somebody up in the upper right, where they're putting all of their trellised crops are at one end of the garden, and then they're not shading out these shorter things. Um, we're going to talk about paths. You can just have dirt be your path, and if a lot of people, if they're using wide rows in a large garden, that's exactly what they'll have. You're going to have to hoe it to kind of keep the weeds down. But it's there and it's free. Mulch, you can use hardwood mulch or some other type of mulch, but and that really looks nice. Every year or two, you're going to have to put some more on, but that's okay. That's it's easy to mulch a path. Um, Sod, as I mentioned before, it needs to be wide enough to run a mower through, or it's gonna you're just gonna have a bunch of weedy grass. Purchased ground cover, gravel. Um, Now, pavers, some people, it's probably the most expensive option, but if you've got permanent raised beds, you can pave in between them. Um, they stay nice and clean. Hopefully, you don't get too many little weeds coming up um, in between them. And now, old carpet strips. Sometimes jute back carpet can be used for um, uh, pathways. And one of the advantages is it's usually free. When you want to avoid that foam rubber type backed carpet, you're really looking for the jute, or the fabric backed. Um so it's free. It doesn't look the greatest. Yes, so ground cover, I do mean weed barrier fabric. um but yeah, the carpet strips, I tried it a couple of years, but it's like a slug hotel. You pull up that carpet, and it's just like that's where they hide at night, and then they come out to. So the old carpet strip is kind of a fail in my opinion. But it is free, and if you've got a lot of ground to cover, then you might find that it's adequate. Paths, usually you want them to be 18 to 36 inches, depending on if 18 inches is fine for walking. And you got to, you got, it's always a good idea to go out and squat and see if your squatted body fits into an 18-inch spot or not. Mine does not.
Well, how far apart my knees end
Yeah,
up.
exactly, from one end to the other. So when you're thinking about how big your paths should be, and do you want to get a wheelbarrow in there, even a small wheelbarrow, you're going to need about 3 feet, or a garden cart. So think about that when you're planning your paths. But yeah, ground cover, I guess when I'm saying that, it's definitely the rolled out weed barrier fabric that you can buy. And it's I would get the heavy dutiest one I can get, because it doesn't have to be replaced so often. Um, but it usually comes in rows for anywhere from 3, 4, 6, even usually 12 inches you have to buy from a greenhouse supply place, or 12 feet you have to buy from a greenhouse supply place. But oh, you can even get ground cover from Amazon now. There's everything else, just lands on your doorstep. Um, so, and then up in the upper corner, this is that weed barrier fabric that looks to be like a 3 foot wide type. Um, I if maybe they're using what they have. I would try to get the widest one possible because then you have less seams, because seams are just unless you overlap several inches, your seam in between is just going to be another place for weeds to come up. When we use we like to use this type of ground cover fabric for when we do our tomatoes, and we overlap it several inches when we and that works really well. um, they're using stakes on this one. You can buy staples, which are very large u-shaped ground staples, 6 to 8 inches long usually, and just pound those in. It keeps it down, keeps the wind from blowing it away. um, and then you could, another form is I mean, a straw mulch garden is lovely. It really is, especially when it's first applied. Um, but it does a great job of holding in moisture. Way back in 1988, which is probably before some of you were even born, but we had a terrible drought. It was the worst one of my lifetime, of my awareness of droughts, and trees were dying and losing their leaves. And basically, I was able to get enough straw and grass clippings early in the year to really mulch my tomatoes, and we had a really successful garden that year. It was without having to water too much. So successful in the fact that we actually had a rabbit raise her babies and a mulch and around my tomatoes. And we just had an understanding about that I wouldn't bother them and they wouldn't bother me. Um, or just hoeing and keeping weeds down in your paths. It's kind of a meditative thing to go out and hoe. um, you can kind of get in the zone, pretend the weeds are your mortal enemies. um, so that's not a bad way to do it either. Now, what you can add to your soil. We talked a bit about compost. Compost, if you can make your own, you can buy it already made. um, but it's great stuff. It helps the structure of your soil. It helps it retain moisture, um, and it's got a lot of trace elements in it that is going to be that your plants need. Um, Green manure, I explained before too, is that's kind of the lower left. You can in the fall you can plant rye. Is probably winter rye is probably the most common one that's used in Michigan, because it will you can plant it in the fall and it'll come up. It'll survive the winter, and then in the spring you can turn it over. That does require either a tiller or just hand forking it over, turning it upside down. So it's a little bit more labor intensive than some of the other methods. Um, vermicomposting is where you're actually keep worm bins, and with these special little worms called red wigglers. They're not the same as the earthworms we find in our garden, but they're not as hardy as the earthworms you find in our garden. So usually these types of worm bins are kept, in somebody's basement or utility room or something like that. They really don't smell as if they're done right. And but the worms create the compost that comes from those worms is so full of their manure, which is very safe and very good for plants. um, so you can do a lot. You can do that on a small scale or a large scale. But in Michigan, you just have to remember that these wigglers won't survive the winter as a rule. So you've got to bring your worm operation inside where it's a little warmer. And and then cover crops, you can use when you're actually planting your plants. You can plant something else around them. A real common one is clover, because the white clover doesn't get real tall it forms a mat. It fixes nitrogen in the soil, so it's really nutritious. And you just plant it around your plants, and it forms basically a living mulch around your other plants. That's kind of illustrated on the lower right. I don't. That is not um, clover. I don't. I'm not sure what it is, but you can use. Um, um, oh, geez, I'm blanking. There's quite a few cover crops you can use, but like I said most of the time around here, use clover for the summer. Buckwheat is another one that grows fast, but it doesn't survive the winter. So that might be something you could use in the fall. Grow a quick buckwheat, turn it in, and then you've got a lot of extra. Um, if you do that every year, your soil is going to be like liquid gold, or soil gold, not liquid, but it's just going to be great. Um, Compost can be made a couple of different ways. Making quick compost, which is available in a few weeks or even a few short months, you have to kind of do it, but like a recipe. You have to have a certain amount of hot materials, which are grass clippings. And you have to be careful with grass clippings if you're going to use them for mulch in your garden, because they actually heat up when they're first clipped, and you can actually scorch your plants. So grass clippings, you want to either let them lay until they dry a little bit and then rake them up and put them on your garden, or compost them first. But they will heat up your compost pile. Greens, you can put manure in there if you want. You can use kitchen scraps. And then you have to, in addition to the hot materials, you have to have your brown things, your crunchy things, straw, wood chips, dry leaves, shredded. And you kind of put some compost in there for a starter if you've got some from a previous batch. Or you can just use soil, because soil are full of microbes, and you kind of want to inoculate your compost bin with that. This compost does best when it's turned. That's why you have multi-sectioned compost bins, like on the lower left, so that you can like put it all in one, and then you can turn it, put it into, take a fork and shovel it into the next one, and then shovel it into the next one. By that time, it's all done. A little more labor intensive. You can get compost makers that actually spin on a little rack. You put the items in there every day. You give it a little turn, or every couple of days. Um, and you can have a compost pile that's, if you haven't got room and you have just a little spot, you can just pound a couple of stakes in and put some hardware cloth around them, and just something to keep it up there. Um, if you do this and get a real hot compost pile, sometimes in the winters you can actually see steam coming out of the top of them. They get so hot. That kills weed seeds. It kills pathogens, and things that might be passed along to your plants. And it's awesome, but it's also, you've got to stay on top of it. It's if for those who are a little more lackadaisical in their compost making, like myself, you can just do um, put everything in a pile and leave it till it's done, and you can start one and fill it up and then move on to another one. And when that one's done, you put it into a wheelbarrow. You can sift it through a compost screen and throw any bigger chunks back into the compost for another go. Um, this is a way we do it. It's because it's easy. I don't have time to fuss with compost too much, but I still want to have it. And then there's trench composting, where you can actually dig a shallow trench in your garden at some point. Throw all of your kitchen scraps, leaves, things like that, spent plants, and then cover it up with soil and move on to another spot. And then that's just going to compost right in the ground, and then you can just plant in it the next year. And you can, like got that little diagram here. But this is, you have to be pretty organized. The other thing you can do is just have, when you take out your garbage, just find a spot that's not planted, and dig a hole and put your garbage in and cover it back up. And ultimately it's all going to be used. It's better than throwing it in a landfill, and it can um, help your garden. But like I said, this is a pretty organized way of composting with this trench method, but I think it's intriguing. Uh, Now, to extend your season for your garden, there's lots of things you can do. That's this fabric in the lower pictures is called floating row cover. It's a spun bonded product. It comes. It used to be Remay had a. It's called Remay, but now it's just called floating row cover. It's very light. You can lay it right on top of your plants. You don't have to put it over a hoop or something. You can, but you don't have to because it won't hurt the plants to lay it right on top, and it saves quite a you know it can bring saves quite a bit of temperature. If it's 29 degrees outside, hopefully it's going to be 34 or 35 under the cover. um, and you can use like tomato cages to hold it up if you don't want it touching your plants. um, the middle there is wall of water. Kind of an expensive method. They're a pain. I Some people have a lot of success with them. But you can also cut the bottom out of a milk can and make little individual cloches to put over your plants, and if it's going to get real cold. Um, the very top one is plastic over a frame. You just have to make sure that you get out first thing in the morning and pull that off, take it off your plants, because that can become a really hot little oven for and cook your plants if you don't get it off of there. So again, if you're not very if you're going to forget and go to work and come home, you might have some fried plants. So if you think you're too busy for that, you might want to stick with the spun bonded row covers, because those can stay on all day. They let air in and out. They won't create a hot box. Here's some more options. This is a cold frame made from hay bales. When you're done, you can take it away. But they basically built hay bales all around and made them a little taller on this side. They put a frame over it that pulls some plastic down at night, roll it up during the day. Very low tech. Um, you can buy this ventilated um, plastic, which is pretty handy for letting the heat out. You can make a little greenhouse out of PVC pipe and some type of. You can buy them ready made like this, like a little kit, or you can make it with some poly um, plastic. And this lower right is this lady enjoying her snow covered um, cold frame. You can grow things in there all year long, like some of your hardier lettuces and mustards, maybe daikon radishes. In the fall, you can clean up your garden. If your squash plants have a lot of mildew on them, you might not want to put that in your compost. At least the compost that you're like, it sometimes helps to have more than one type of compost. You can have a compost that you can put around your trees and your shrubs, and another compost for your garden. But you want to be careful if your tomato plants had a blight. You might be better off just taking those things and not putting them in your compost pile. Those pathogens, unless you have a really hot pile, those pathogens are definitely going to overwinter and could cause problems the next year. Um, so you can put your cover crop in if you want. You can, but yeah, and you don't have to remove everything in the fall. If you're a seed saver, you might want to leave some things that are biennials so that they come up the next year and set seeds. So you can be as tidy as you want. um, Critter control, always, there's scarecrows. I bought some of these owls. I'm going to try those this summer, mostly for the ground squirrels and the groundhogs and the rabbits. And I guess the owls you have to move around because they get wise to them after a while if they never move. So
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say, is you have to remember to move the
yeah,
owls.
they catch on. They go, that owl hasn't moved in 6 weeks. I think I'm going to go eat. Um, and you can also get owls that move too. That when the wind catches them, they move. Um, the big eye thing, that again some animals see that big eye. There's um, things that make noise if they're motion sensors or sprinklers that go on when the motion is sent. You can buy repellents. I would want to make sure that whatever's in the repellent, is something you want to have in your garden. um, and then there's of course plain old fencing. um, oh yeah, there's that terrified deer running from the sprinkler. um, there's always, I don't know how practical it is to do this on a large scale unless you just use farm fence. But you to keep deer out, you really have to have 6 to 8 feet. And and a deer is not likely to jump into a small enclosure like this large one, this picture on the bottom. It's not big enough for them to jump in and out of effectively. But they can scale a 6 foot fence to get in, if they can get a running start. This one up in the upper right is where the people actually dug down a foot or two and put in some chicken wire that they attached to their other fence, trying to keep the digging animals out, the anything, um, anything from weasels to um, groundhogs, ground squirrels, and rabbits. But you know, there's always something. I mean, a regular squirrel, like that's not going to stop them. So you kind of just have to do your best and plant extra for the critters. Um, this in the upper right is actually a portable electric fence. We've used these a lot of times around our corn because we don't want to fence around it all year long. But about the time that you're about 10 minutes before you realize that your corn is just at the perfect rightness, the raccoons are going to realize it, and the groundhogs. So you'll go out, with your bucket ready to pick the corn to have for dinner because it's ready, and then you'll see, they pull down a whole bunch of your stalks to get to them. Corn is sweet. Their stalks are sweet. They're full of water. So a lot of times that's what they're after too. So if you're having a drought period, sometimes just keeping some bowls of water around your yard will keep, that's the animals are just looking for something to drink. Um, a lot of people are definitely afraid of snakes, but in Michigan, they do not harm people. They would prefer not to be around you, and they will eat. Some, depending on the type of snakes, they eat slugs, they eat insects, they eat rodents. Some of them, so they're actually a good thing. Um, Toads are a good thing to encourage in your garden. They like to have some moist places to spend. They come out more at night, so they like to have some moist places to spend the day. So some people put like half buried flower pots in their garden for them to kind of give them a place to hide. Um, and then, like I said, good old fashioned fencing. And you can put a temporary fence up. These are just stakes pounded in the ground with some chicken wire. Sometimes I've done that when I first plant my garden to keep until the plants get to the point where the rodents won't be so hard on them. They do, but to put out if you started your cabbage or broccolis from seed and you've babied them along and you finally plant them out and they come out the next day and find them all mowed down by a rabbit, it's kind of disheartening. Once the plants get to be a foot or two high, if a rabbit comes along and takes a nibble, it's not going to kill the plant. But if, when it's first set out and it's only a few inches tall, they could, mow it down to the bottom. So sometimes the temporary fence um, is necessary to keep them out at first. We're gonna blast through this, but you got to choose your crops according in Michigan. Generally, mid-May to mid-October is safe frost-free dates, but not necessarily. Last year, September 7th, I know exactly the day because it's burned in my mind because so many things in my fall garden were stopped because, like, say you're planting turnips, and your turnips can take a lot of frost, but they're not going to grow much after that. So you want your plants to be the size they're going to be by the time you get your first frost. And I got caught. We had our first watch frost last year was probably a good 4 to 5 weeks early. And so um, the good news is I left all those tiny little plants in the garden, and most of them overwintered, and they will go to seed this year because they're biennials, but I can collect the seed from them. So it's not a total loss. Um, some plants are direct seeded versus transplants. Transplants are things you either start yourself or buy. Like most time people do eggplants, peppers, tomatoes are, and often the things like cabbages they just buy the transplants or start them from seed. Direct seeding are things that actually do better when they're just seeded into the garden, and that's beans, squash, melons, things like that. That you can start them indoors, but they really get set back by transplanting, and you actually will be farther ahead to direct seed them. Buy what your family will eat. If your family just hates spinach with a passion, and you can't get and you don't like it yourself. I mean, if you like it and they don't, well, that's all right. You can still grow it. But if nobody's going to eat it, then it's just not worth giving your garden space to it. So definitely plant what your family likes. Um, and you've got to consider your space. Corn needs to be planted in a block because it's wind pollinated. So you have to have 4, 5, 6 um, rows of corn to make sure everything gets pollinated. So that's not really a good balcony plant. You can't plant one corn plant and expect to get, first of all, you're only going to get 1 or 2 ears, and second of all, they're not going to pollinate well. So that grow. Keep in mind what you could if you have only got a little bit of room, maybe squash or zucchini isn't the thing to you because they get pretty large plants with big large leaves. Um, so you got to consider that your sun exposure. You're going to get your greens and your cold crops like broccolis and things like that. They can get by with if you say 6 to 8 hours, they're going to get by with the 5 or 6 hours. Um, and some of the other crops they're going to need 8 to 10 hours. So if you got a partially shaded ground, plant salad crops, plant broccoli, plant things like that, rather than going for real heat and sun loving crops. And your salads will, most of your salad crops love to have a little bit of shade during the day in the heat of the day. And if something needs supports, if you can't provide a trellis for something, if you just haven't got the means for it, don't grow pole beans, grow bush beans. So try to keep things like that in mind. There's a lot of things that vine, like cucumbers and squash, have been there are varieties that are more bushy and less, they don't send out the huge long vines. So keep in mind what you're growing, and if you can't grow vertically, then buy plants that are bush types, bush cucumbers, bush zucchini, things like that. um, Somebody asked when to plant spinach. Right now, if you haven't already. Spinach loves it cool. It's as soon as the heat hits in June and July, they're going to bolt to seed, which isn't a bad thing either. But you definitely don't want to wait any longer to plant your spinach. It loves the cool weather. Um, so, what to grow in your garden? Tomatoes are the number one plant vegetable, which technically are they're a fruit, but they're the number one garden plant in the United States. More people plant tomatoes than anything else. Salad greens, cucumbers, squash, beans, um, broccoli, cabbage, kale, carrots, beets, onions, and potatoes, winter squash, and pumpkins. Those are all the most popular things that people grow. Root crops you do need for carrots, especially. Um, you need a well prepared soil. If you're growing them in a container, you need a deep container. Beets and onions grow a little more up to the surface. So they don't, it's not quite as important that it be super deep if especially if you're growing in a container. But carrots definitely you want a good 12 inches to grow your carrots. Potatoes again, they're supposed to be really good in the grow bags or containers. I'm going to try that. I usually just grow them in my raised beds. They're easy to harvest in that nice soft soil. Um, yeah, squash and pumpkins. Pumpkins are always they're a dual purpose crop. You can plant them and use them for decoration, and then later you can eat them if you grow the pie pumpkin types. Um, so yeah, most people start out with tomatoes and peppers, green beans, um, carrots, onions. Onions you can grow from seed, but you have to start the seed pretty early. So most people, if they haven't started seeds early, they get sets, which are just basically little miniature onions that you plant in the ground and they grow into full size onions. Um, Greens are super easy and popular, and like I said, you could grow them right in a anything from a dish pan to a pot. Um, Summer squash. Uh, lo- a lot of people love zucchini and yellow crookneck squash, things like that. Um, Bush cucumbers. You can grow a vine cucumber if you have a trellis. Um, but bush cucumbers are easier if you don't have a lot of extra. Cabbages are good. Not everybody likes cabbage. If your family doesn't like cabbage, I wouldn't grow it. Um, we burn through an incredible amount of cabbage at our house, so it's a big crop for us. Um, and basil, parsley, and dill are super popular. And other flowers that are really hand in glove with gardens is nasturtiums and marigolds. You tend to see a lot of them. Marigolds you can get different site heights, so you can, depending on if you just want a border around your plants, you get the ones that get to be 8, 10, 12 inches tall. Nasturtiums are edible. You can eat both their flower and their buds that they form, their seed pod that they form after they flower. They're kind of spicy. Be prepared for that. Um, so, April and early May, right now, even though it's going to possibly snow, so you might want to wait a few days. But lettuce, spinach, radish, chard, kale, spinach, cabbage, Chinese cabbage, pak choi, peas, beets, carrots. Fava beans are one of the only beans that you can plant early. Um, Turnips, kohlrabi, and rutabaga. These all like to grow in cool conditions. They like cool nights. They like cool soil. Um, they germinate best in cool soil. And again, if you want to buy transplants, you can try transplants of a lot of those broccoli, cauliflower, and cabbage are usually available in the nurseries. Um, Onions, leeks, you they have a really long growing season. Sometimes you can find those in the commercial greenhouses. Um, Again, seed starting is a whole nother program, but it's possible to start your own of all of these too if you get enough of a start. Um, so in these early plants, as soon as the ground can be worked, and by that I mean that it's not soggy and it's not frozen. Um, and then if you have seedlings, harden them off before planting them. That just means you take them outside, get them used, like for a few hours a day, bring them in, and then get them used to sun, get them used to wind. Wind is actually more destructive sometimes to your baby plants than sun, full sun can be. Because a lot of times when you buy something at a greenhouse, it's been in a greenhouse. It hasn't been exposed to full sun. So if you buy from a greenhouse that has all their stuff sitting outside, maybe they've done that work for you. So you just have to kind of take it. But you want to make sure that they're ready to take on sun and wind and rain and all those things before you put them out. Later in May, for some reason, people really seem to be fixated on Mother's Day for planting out warm weather crops, and if you've lived in Michigan more than 1 year, you know that the Mother's Day is usually around the 10th, give or take, May. And we definitely get frosts after that. Um, the night, so pay attention to the night and look at the long range forecast. If it looks like clear sailing, then maybe you can take uh, a chance, but it's generally better to wait till late May or even the 1st of June to plant a lot of these really warm loving plants like beans, squash, cucumbers, sweet corn, okra, melons. um, they do not care um, at all about for getting cold. So you now parsnips, beets, greens, most of the carrots, most of those can take a little bit of cold. You could definitely put those out in May, but they're best direct seeded, not from transplants. Um, so for transplants, look for peppers, eggplants, tomatoes, tomatillos, Brussels sprouts, celery, sweet potatoes, and basil. Generally, don't put your Brussels sprouts out as early as everything else. Otherwise, they come in too soon. Brussels sprouts are um, definitely benefit from a good chill in the fall, in a freeze, and that makes them sweeter. They taste better. So if you plant them too soon, by fall they'll be all blown up. They kind of bloom. They just kind of get loose and they're not is appealing anymore. So Brussels sprouts, it's better to wait a little while to put those in. Celery, sweet potatoes, probably of all the plants is the most cold sensitive. So generally, definitely wait into June to put in your sweet potatoes unless it's extraordinarily warm. Um, so yeah, all danger of frost is past, soil is warm. So Mother's Day doesn't usually fit those criterias. Um, in fall, you can usually, when I say planting in fall, you can start planting in even July for a lot of these things. And which means is they're going to come mature in the fall. And um, anything from the broccoli family, cabbage, pak choi, any of those things are so much better planted in the fall. Same with beets and carrots and turnips and like daikon radishes. If you plant those in July and they mature in the fall, they're just all the best. Garlic has to be planted in the fall. If you plant, usually garlic comes in late summer if you harvest it, and if you save some of your cloves, you can plant them again in the fall, or you'll plant them a couple months later. Usually put in garlic around October, sometimes September. Um, uh, greens grow fast, so you can get kale, chard, spinach, arugula, mesclun mixes. They can all be put in. Lettuce. I don't know why lettuce isn't in there, but yeah, definitely lettuce. Um, and then things that you planted in the spring are still going to come due in the fall. You can continue to plant kale and chard well into fall. Your leeks are long season, so they're just going to be ready in the fall. And leeks can take quite a bit of cold too. You can leave them out there. Actually, sometimes all winter, they'll survive. Parsnips, rutabaga, carrots, daikon, radish, all those things that are planted earlier can still be planted in the fall. So, but when you plant your transplant, except for tomatoes, plant the soil at the same depth that was growing in the pot. You don't want to bury the stem too much. That can cause rot. Tomatoes are the exception to the rule. Tomatoes will actually form roots on their stems. So you can plant them deeper than they were growing. Firm in the soil around them to eliminate air pockets. Give them a good watering. If you have trouble with cutworms are a it's not a caterpillar, it's not fuzzy, but it's a worm that lives in a top inch or two of soil, and it'll move through the soil, and it basically just will snip your plant off right at the ground level. So if you go out and you find your little plant is just laying there like somebody cut it with scissors, that's a cutworm. They're not very bright. They're easily defeated, though. You can put a collar around them of cardboard, or even a yogurt cup with the bottom cut out. Just something you can take off later. But once the worm actually encircles the plant, um, and if once he can't do that anymore, he's not going to be able to cut it. So once the stem of the plant is a little thicker, then you don't need the collar anymore. Um, give you can put some compost in the planting soil or the planting hole, or you can side dressing, which basically means just putting compost along right at the drip line of the plant, which is usually a couple of inches. Just put the compost around it, or in a row. If you're planting in a row, just put a compost, but it basically will seep into the soil and fertilize your plants. um, Planting seeds is easy. You plant them near the surface. Large seeds, every seed about 2 to 3 times their thickness. So a tiny little carrot seed, you're barely going to cover. A pea seed, a bean seed, a squash seed, you're probably going to put down about 3 inches, 2 to 3 inches. And then pat the soil to make good contact. You don't want to press it down on it, but you want to make sure that the soil is completely around the seeds. Water them well. If you've got small seeds like carrots, they would be easily washed away by a forceful stream. So using a watering wand is a good way to water them. Watch for the germination. You probably have to thin them out, so that most peas and beans like to be about 2 to 3 inches apart. Carrots, same. You got to give them, not thinning. It's hard to thin because you feel like you're taking out beautiful little living plants and killing them, but plants that are growing too close together don't do well, and you're ultimately not going to get a good crop. So the last couple of slides here, I don't know if you want to take a picture of them. We'll probably post the slideshow on our website in a couple of days. But these are just some links you can go to for a lot of gardening information. There's tons of gardening information online now, to the point where it's almost difficult to sift through what's really good, good information and what's not. But Mother Earth News has a great, amount of content on their site. So these are all some place you can go. If you've got your camera handy, you can take a picture of it, the slide. But these are just some recommended. But there's tons of information. Facebook groups are, if you're on Facebook, there's some excellent Facebook groups, and this is by no means all of them, but there is a Michigan Gardening Connection, which is excellent. It's a very active group. People ask questions, what do I do about this? I've never had before. What is this plant that's growing in my garden? Is this a good plant, or should I weed it out? Things like that. Square Foot Gardening has there's a raised bed gardening. And like I said, there's variations of all these things. And then there's another vegetable gardener in Michigan group too. Um, I'm on all four of these, and like I said, probably the Michigan Gardening Connection's the most active one of all. There's tons of YouTube videos. There's a guy in, where is he? I feel like he's in the northern Oakland County, possibly. But he does a lot of videos. He's a Michigan, he calls himself the Michigan Gardener. He's got a seed company, but he puts out some good videos. But there's lots of, again, keep in mind that you want to watch videos that talk about Michigan, or at least northern states. It's, getting a lot of information from somebody who's growing in Southern California or Florida or Texas. Their timing is going to be all off for us. And those states, they grow stuff in the wintertime when we've got snow. They're just grow, that's when they grow their broccoli and things like that can take the cool. So try to watch videos or go to websites that kind of, and keep in mind that of northern growers. I think that's about it. I didn't see too many questions. If anybody has any questions to put in the chat, now's the time. Um, so,
Yeah, I
um,
think we covered just about everything that was asked in the chat.
okay.
Excellent job, Pam.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and I'm always available by email. You can go to the website. There's on LTPL Grows is a page on the library website, and we have lots of links to different videos. I think that's where when we put these Facebook, or I mean, when we put these programs online. Um, Okay, somebody asks if you are you able to directly seed if you're unable to transplant. Well, they it depends on what it is. Tomatoes, if you were to directly transplant tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, onions right now, they probably won't mature before we get our first frost. So you're definitely better off if you haven't started seeds yourself. You're better off to get transplants for those. Now, things like cucumbers and squash and melons and beans and root crops like beets and carrots and rutabagas, things like that, they can all be direct seeded um, now and some of them throughout the summer. You can keep grow as you pull something out, put something else in. Um, that's how I like to grow beets and carrots throughout the summer. Keep every few weeks, start another batch, and then the last batch is going to be ready to pull in the fall. Um, so yeah, there's still lots of things you can direct seed now, and even peas. I mean, it's still cool enough to plant peas, and a lot of like I said, radishes, turnips, things like that. Um, but you still got plenty of time before the summer heat really hits in a normal year. In Michigan, there I don't know if we ever have a normal year, but um, so yeah, there's just a handful of things that you'd probably want to get um, transplant by or um, that you can't seed right into the ground.
All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to stop the recording.
All righty.